Good morning. It's Wednesday, September 11th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 341 days old. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Today is a somber day, and it's one with particular significance for us at FDD. Founded in the wake of 9/11 nearly 2.5 decades ago, we've committed ourselves to the mission of keeping the United States and all free nations safe. Much progress has been made toward that end in some ways, but there have been some serious setbacks too. Here's what I know. We're going to keep fighting, and we're glad to have you join us as we chronicle that fight right here on the FDD Morning Brief every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Today's guest is FDD's very own Cliff May. Our founder and president has a storied career from journalism in Africa to political communications here in the swamp, and then 22 years here at FDD. He's a repeat offender, a returning guest here at the FDD Morning Brief. This morning, he'll share with us his assessment of the global fight against tyranny and terror. We'll hear from him in just a few minutes. After 11 months of war, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said yesterday that Israel's mission in Gaza is nearly complete. Hamas as a military organization is no more. He says it's time for the IDF to pivot to Lebanon, where war with Hezbollah beckons. My two shekels, Hamas is definitely a spent force, but Israel simply can't leave. Yes, Israel needs to prepare for war with Hezbollah, but Israel can't bounce out of Gaza without securing the Philadelphia corridor, the border area between Gaza and Egypt. Israeli troops have discovered dozens of tunnels in Philadelphia since taking control of the area in July. Hamas uses these tunnels to move men, money, and weapons. They're critical supply lines that must be crushed to prevent Hamas from regrouping. Israel can secure Philadelphia by building a below-ground anti-terror barrier. A similar one exists all along the Israel-Gaza border, and it was probably the only thing that worked on October 7th. Here's the rub. Buy-in from the Egyptians is critical, and Cairo is not having any of it. It's time for Washington to intervene. So far, the Biden administration has refused to pressure anyone but Israel. That has to change. Egypt gobbles up more than $1 billion U.S. taxpayer dollars each year, and not a peep from the White House? Come on. This is the moment of truth, folks. If the Biden administration truly wants Israel to end the war in Gaza, it has to finally push Egypt to fix this problem. And man, is that long overdue. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Secretary of State Antony Blinken confirmed that Iran is sending close-range ballistic missiles to Russia. Folks, this is big. It's no secret that Iran and Russia have a military partnership. It's also no secret that Tehran has been supplying Russia with drones for use against Ukraine. Rumors about missile transfers have been swirling for weeks, but until yesterday, no U.S. or allied official had publicly confirmed it. Now we know. The missiles have a maximum range of 75 miles. Russia can use them to strike targets close to the front line, freeing up other munitions for use against targets deeper inside Ukraine. Blinken acknowledged the missile transfers at a press conference with his British counterpart, David Lammy. Shortly thereafter, the US, UK, and other European allies imposed sanctions that included the regime's national airline, Iran Air. Iran Air has long been a key part of the regime's proliferation pipeline. Here at FDD, we've been pushing Washington to designate the airline for years. Better late than never, I suppose. Headline 2, Israeli police intercepted a weapons smuggling ring at the Jordanian border. Yesterday, the Israeli police said they stopped a suspicious vehicle at the Rabin crossing near Eilat. Inside, they discovered a whopping 74 handguns and 61 magazines. The driver and the passenger, both Bedouins, were arrested. The incident happened on Sunday, the same day that a Jordanian gunman killed 3 Israelis at the Allenby crossing, which connects Jordan to the West Bank. I said it on Monday morning's episode, and I'll say it again. Jordan is fertile ground for smuggling, not only weapons, but also drugs. And who's driving a lot of that illegal traffic? Yeah, we all know it. The Islamic Republic of Iran. And headline 3, on Monday, Israeli forces busted a Palestinian terror cell in the middle of Israel's Highway 6, just outside of Tel Aviv. After receiving an intel tip, Israeli police and Shin Bet special forces intercepted a van on the central highway, bringing traffic to a standstill. Israeli forces then pulled 13 undocumented Palestinians from the vehicle and arrested one who was plotting an imminent terrorist attack. This all went down in broad daylight. The aspiring attacker subsequently revealed information during interrogation that led to the arrest of 2 more terrorists and the confiscation of weapons. near the West Bank city of Hebron. FDD's Joe Truzman continues to track more than 24 terror groups operating in the West Bank. They are expanding their violent operations. And once again, the source of all the weapons, cash, and training is, you guessed it, the regime in Iran. Anyone picking up on a theme here? Yeah. Oh, and bonus headline 4. An American investment advisory firm is citing the Palestine Chronicle to justify negative ratings of companies that do business with Israel. Let's unpack this for a minute. In July, U.S. lawmakers urged Attorney General Merrick Garland to investigate and potentially revoke the tax-exempt status of the Palestine Chronicle and its parent company after news broke that one of its former writers held 3 Israeli hostages in his Gaza home. As for the investment advisory firm, it's called MSCI. It's based in New York, and it assigns environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, ratings to companies to tell investors where and where not to put their money. Apparently, MSCI assigned a damaging rating to Caterpillar, an American company that manufactures construction equipment, based on reports from the Palestine Chronicle. And in case you're wondering, MSCI is already under investigation in more than 24 states here in the U.S. for violating boycott laws. Check out my colleague Rich Goldberg's work on this. It's worth reading, even if it sends your blood pressure through the roof. Okay, I'm now pleased to introduce Cliff May. As a foreign correspondent, Cliff traveled the world to report on conflicts from the front lines. He was in Tehran just before the revolution that changed the trajectory of the Middle East. He served as an election observer in Ukraine as it fought corruption and pivoted away from authoritarian influence in Moscow and toward the West. Most importantly, he founded what I firmly believe is the best national security think tank in Washington. Also, to his credit, he doesn't make fun of me for being terrible at golf. Let's go to him live right now on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome, Cliff May.
Very good to be with you, Jonathan Schanzer.
All right. Well, let's start with a big picture question for you. When you founded FDD, you focused on the most pressing threat at hand, and that was jihadism, which, as we know, is still a threat today. But there seemed to be real hope that other powers, even China and Russia, could be partners in that fight. That's clearly not the case today. You wrote about this and other issues in your column for the Washington Times, but let's just go back. What happened here with this great power stuff that pivoted, that shifted right under our feet?
One of the reasons that I and others, including Jeane Kirkpatrick, who, as you know, was Reagan's ambassador to the UN, and Jack Kemp, who I'm sure you know was a very famous politician close to Ronald Reagan and a very visionary philanthropist. One of the reasons we thought there was a need for FDD was because too many people thought that once the Berlin Wall fell, once the Soviet Union collapsed, we had no enemies out there. And we saw that we did have enemies who attacked us in Beirut in 1983, in New York in 1993, in 1996. There was the attack on Colbert Towers, 1998, 2 of our embassies blown up in Africa. USS Cole attacked off Yemen in 2000. But look, it was, in a way, this was an easier time because, yes, we had the problem with terrorism and with jihadism, a new word back 23 years ago. We had a problem with non-state actors and one state actor, the Islamic Republic of Iran. But Russia and China, we thought, would be with us or certainly not against us. It was also in 2001 that President Bush met with Vladimir Putin. He said, I looked into his eyes. I saw his soul. He's sincere. He's trustworthy. Also in 2001, the People's Republic of China is given most favored nation status by the U.S. and brought into the World Trade Organization. The belief was, once they get rich, they'll be moderate. That's not what happened.
And by the way, I'm sensing a theme here, right? I mean, this is exactly what we did with the Iranians in 2013 and 2015, the interim nuclear deal and the JCPOA, that final nuclear deal in 2015. The thinking there was, hey, you know what? We're going to give them sanctions relief. We're going to welcome them into the community of nations, the U.S.-led world order, and that's going to moderate them. This is a theme, is it not?
Yes. And, you know, John, what I would say is that America and the West, we do not have strategies. We have theories. And no matter how many times these theories are disproven, We continue to believe them. And what you're talking about is, yes, let's engage with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Let's show respect for their equities. Let's help them get rich. If we do that, they will become good stakeholders in the international US-led rules-based liberal world order. We've tried this over and over again with these various autocracies, aggressors. Can talk about what we should call them. And it doesn't work. And yet we don't try anything new. We try the same thing and say, maybe this time it'll work out better.
Yeah, like the reset button, right? I mean, that's
Like
another
the
example
reset
of it.
button.
That's right. I mean, it's really amazing how many times we can do this over and over.
Just
Uh,
remind people, reset button was with Russia, with Putin. Okay, you invaded Georgia, you took a couple of provinces, no worries. What does Putin go on to do? Take Crimea. I'm sure he's satisfied with that. What does he do? 2022, he invades Ukraine with tanks to take over the whole country. The war continues.
Correct. So I think we can now say this across the axis of aggressors, we're seeing the same theme here. Well, we've spoken on this show before about this axis of aggressors at a time when some on the right seem to downplay the threat of Moscow and the left can't seem to get it right on Tehran. And we're only starting to get smart about the dangers in Beijing. What's your message to decision makers and lawmakers right now about this triple threat to democracy?
The threat we face now from the axis of aggressors, if you call it what you will, axis of tyrannies is what Waller Newell, a scholarly expert on tyrannies, and I called it a few years ago. This is the most powerful communist party the world has ever known in Beijing, allied with the neo-imperialists in Moscow, allied with the Islamists in Tehran, allied with Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and of course, North Korea. North Korea, Russia, and China, they all have nuclear weapons. Very clear, or it should be, that this is a much more threatening set of adversaries than we ever had during the Cold War. Are we understanding that at the State Department, at the Pentagon, and the White House? I'd say no. Are we preparing for this kind of Cold War 2.0, which is what people like historian Neil Ferguson and H.R. McMaster, who works with us, would call it. We are not preparing. You are not going to win a war that you don't recognize you're fighting and you don't mobilize to fight well.
Yeah, I do think we need a reframing of all of this. But I do want to circle back to non-state actors and radical jihadism for a minute. That represented the most salient threat when you founded FDD. What's your assessment of the danger that these groups, these non-state actors, pose today compared to the threat of authoritarian nation states? Should we rank them? Can we rank them? How do we sort of describe that order of battle?
First, a lot of them are already aligned with this axis of aggressors. Keep in mind that the regime in Tehran is the world's leading sponsor of terrorism. A group like, say, the Houthis in Yemen, which is preventing freedom of the seas, one of the most fundamental of international laws, and showing that America can't stop them. They're not even a state, but we're not beating them. At best, we're shooting down their arrows. We're not killing their archers. So terrorism is still important, but also Al-Qaeda is not done and the Islamic State is not done. The Islamic State, Khorasan, was that's the group responsible for killing 13 American servicemen as we chaotically withdrew from Afghanistan, turning the country back over to the Taliban and its ally, Al-Qaeda. And all through West Africa in particular, both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, who are rivals, not enemies, are very much on the march. And the West, the U.S. is getting kicked out. We were kicked out of Niger, which was where our anti-terrorism activities were based. The French are getting kicked out. The Russians and the Chinese are also doing well in terms of exploiting African resources and doing damage to the environment. But these groups, we can say, okay, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, they're in Africa. Who cares what they do in Africa? Remember 23 years ago, people were saying, okay, Al-Qaeda, they're in Afghanistan. Who cares what they do in Afghanistan? That kind of myopia takes a toll.
Yeah, it's funny. As you're talking, Cliff, I started to think about, you mentioned the Houthis. It's interesting that nexus between the authoritarian axis and the terror axis actually is quite clear there, because the Houthis have basically told the Chinese and the Russians that they can traverse the Red Sea while the Houthis target all of these other flagged ships. And I would also note that, and we've heard analysts talk about this from within government, outside of government, that Putin's decision to launch the war in Ukraine in 2022 stemmed in part from how embarrassingly chaotic our withdrawal from Afghanistan was. And so you could begin to see how, we can connect the dots here between these two different fronts, can we not?
Absolutely. You connect the dots. We withdraw and really surrender to the Taliban in Afghanistan. Vladimir Putin looks at that and says, I get it. 1 year later, he invades Ukraine. 1 year after that, guess what happens? Hamas, a proxy of Iran, invades Israel. Yes, you should be able to connect those dots.
So, okay, I think we've established that it's a dual threat. And we've seen a lot of changes in U.S. national security since 9/11, right? We've pivoted from the war on terror to great power competition. I know you don't love that phrase. I don't think I love that phrase. It does sound like an Olympic, event. But I guess the question is, have we done either of these the right way? And maybe if you want to break it down, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong?
Whew. I'm having trouble coming up with what we're doing right. I suppose, look, you can argue that during the years we were in Afghanistan, Al Qaeda was not again able to organize a terrorist event on American soil. That's very important. But to keep in mind that when we left Afghanistan, we proved right what Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, really the architect of the 9/11 attacks, had told his CIA interrogators. He said, the jihadis will win because all we have to do is wait. And you guys, the Americans, the West, you will always defeat yourself by quitting. That's what they believe. And that's what they believe of the Israelis, too. They just keep it up. And eventually the Israelis, if they have another passport, they'll leave. Those who stay behind, maybe Jews who were thrown out of Yemen, thrown out of Morocco, thrown out of Egypt, or left Ethiopia finally after years of oppression, they will be pretty easy target for the Iranians and their proxies, including Hezbollah, including Hamas, including the Houthis, including the Shia militias in Syria and Iraq, and various other groups that have been organized. And keep in mind that Iran is closer than ever to getting nuclear weapons. And although U.S. presidents of both parties have said for years that that's unacceptable, we see no movement to make sure that does not happen. If the Islamic Republic of Iran gets nuclear weapons, it's very much a game changer in a lot of ways, not least for Israel. Israel has to worry about that and think what it can do to delay or prevent that eventuality.
I want to pick up on something that you and I discussed on your podcast, Foreign Policy, which I certainly recommend to all FDD Morning Brief listeners and viewers. We talked about this notion that we continue to hear in our media from our government here in Washington, that Israel can't defeat Hamas because you can't defeat an idea. What do you think about that formulation? I mean, when we look back at Al-Qaeda and ISIS, yeah, they're still around. They're vestiges of these groups, and yes, they still pose a threat, but it's nowhere near what it was. And I look at, Yoav Galant's statement the other day that Hamas is no longer a military organization in Gaza. So they've been defeated there too. What's this whole thing about not being able to win the war of ideas? Where does that leave you?
It's a very strange concept. Look. First of all, what is Hamas's idea? What is Hezbollah's idea? What is Iran's idea? The idea is genocide. The idea is to destroy the Jewish state. The idea is to exterminate the Jewish people. It's not a new idea. The Romans kind of had that idea when the Jews got uppity in Judea. The Nazis had that idea, right? The most lethal form of anti-Semitism in the 20th century was the Nazi idea that there cannot be Jewish communities allowed to live in Europe. Hamas's idea, Hezbollah's idea, Iran's idea is that it's the most lethal form of anti-Semitism. There can be no Jewish community left in the Middle East, and they're going to kill them if they can. Now, look, during World War II, we fought Nazism, and during the Cold War, we fought communism. Is Nazism still around? Yeah. Tucker Carlson really recently interviewed somebody who was at best a Nazi apologist. Is communism still around? Yeah, on American campuses. And again, the most powerful communist party in the world and in history is in China. So you don't kill off those ideas. What Churchill did say and what he understood was you do want to discredit what he called not the idea, but the philosophies. And the best way you do that is you defeat and as best you can, their military capabilities. You defeat their governing capabilities, and then you've discredited the idea. But the idea will persist again, especially if it's such a simple idea as, oh, I know we don't like these people. Let's wipe them off the face of the earth.
Well put. All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you, Cliff May, for joining us live today on the FDD Morning Brief.
My pleasure.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleague Joe Trusman from FDD's Long War Journal has published that aforementioned FDD research profiling 28 terrorist branches in the West Bank belonging to established terrorist organizations and independent armed groups. With Iran-backed terrorist groups growing in both strength and number, Joe's graphic helps break down who's who and highlights recent terror activities by each group. I encourage you to check that out at Long War Journal. Also over at FDD's Long War Journal, my colleagues Ryan Brobst, Brad Bowman, and Behnam Ben Talibu have a new piece on American force posture in the Middle East. The trio asserts that while maintaining a forward U.S. military presence in the Gulf is paramount to securing American interests, Washington must take serious measures to ensure that we not rely too heavily on the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar in particular. That's your regular reminder that Qatar is a state sponsor of Hamas, along with the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and other bad actors. This country cannot and should not be trusted to host our troops. And in case you haven't had enough of me, I've got a new article out in Newsweek co-authored with my FDD colleague and recent Morning Brief guest, Mariam Wahba. Our piece explores those tunnels sneaking into Gaza from Egypt and why, in our view, Cairo is in violation of the Camp David Accords with Israel. We bring the receipts, so I hope you'll give it a read. And that is a wrap for today. Read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read those quick takes of ours on X at FDD. And support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Friday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Our guest will be Daphna Richmond Barak, an expert on international law and, get this, tunnel warfare. I didn't even know that experts existed in this space, and I did a pre-interview with her, or a pre-recorded interview with her yesterday, and it was among the more fascinating interviews I have conducted since we launched this program. So please do check back in for that. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.